Hey, so let's talk some Melacha.
Let's do it.
So, in the past few weeks, we've been talking about planting and plowing, and obviously the next Melacha, the next action after that would be to reap, likto, or the Melacha of Kotzer, as we find it in the Mishnah that we mentioned previously. So, what are the implications for today of Melacha of Kotzer? What are the basic rules of that Melacha?
So the most basic application is that you cannot pick any fruit, flowers, or grass on Shabbos. The Isser would apply to anything that is halachically considered growing. So that would include those types of seeds that sprout in water that we mentioned briefly a couple weeks ago. It wouldn't be a problem, though, to remove detached flowers from the water because those flowers are not halachically growing. There's an interesting fundamental question about how to define kotzer, which will impact the scope of the melacha. Now, when you pick a fruit or vegetable, there are really two things that are happening. One is that you're physically detaching the fruit from its place of growth, and the other is that you're stopping its source of growth. One practical difference would be pouring scalding water on a flower as you're killing its growth without physically detaching it. There's a machlokes about this that seems to go back to the Gemara, but we assume that Melachos kotzer is about actually a physical detachment from its place of growth, not merely cutting off the nutrients. Now, the halachic attachment of attached is a little bit broader than we might think. The Mishnayos and the Gemara talk about something called an utzitz nakav, a perforated flower pot. If there's a little bit of a hole in a flower pot anywhere on the side and the bottom, and it's over the ground, we view that as actually connected to the ground because it's drawing its nutrients through that hole from the ground. Therefore, all the halachas that apply in the ground of zoreya, of choresh, of kotzer that we've mentioned so far would apply to an utzitz nakav as well, to a perforated flower pot. Not only that, if you have an utzitz she'eno nakav, a non-perforated flower pot, there are no holes in it, it's a closed flower pot, or more practically, it's sitting inside your house, so it's not connected to the ground. Nevertheless, you cannot take any of those actions on that flower pot because it's very similar and easily confused with a perforated flower pot over the ground, and therefore it's a problem. So when you have a flower pot in your house, it's not halachically attached to any ground source. Nevertheless, you cannot pluck a flower out of that pot. The Mishnah Berurah notes that if we're talking about an utzitz nakav, a perforated flower pot that's sitting outside over the ground, remember we said before, halachically that's considered attached to the ground. That means now if you move it off the ground onto concrete, let's say, or maybe even move it from one place to another, that's a violation of kotzer because we're detaching it from its place of halachic attachment. We did say we need physical detachment to be a violation of kotzer, but halachically it is considered attached through this hole, and therefore to move it would be a problem. However, in your own house, since it's not attached to the ground at all, poskim seem to assume you would be allowed to move around flower pots. Nevertheless, one might have to be worried about muksa.
Great. So last week when we talked about choresh and davar sheno miskavet, one of the examples we mentioned was walking on the grass. Is there no issue of kotzer over there when you walk on the grass?
That's actually a very fascinating question. On the one hand, when you walk through the grass, you could say you may or may not pluck out a blade of grass as you walk through it. Therefore, it should be permitted to walk through the grass. And this is really what the Gemara tells us. And the Mishnah Berurah notes that this is true even if you have very long blades of grass, because again, it may or may not happen, and you're definitely not intending to pluck out any of the grass as you walk through. However, the Mishnah Berurah makes a strange comment, and he says one should avoid running through the grass on Shabbos. Why should that make a difference? So Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, the great 20th century posek of Yerushalayim, explains the following distinction. When you walk in the grass, even if you're walking for a long time, and the truth is, over the course of your 10-minute walk, you'll definitely pluck out some grass. But each step is viewed separately, and each step may or may not happen, and therefore it's permitted. However, when you run, suggests Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, perhaps a run is considered like one big action. It's one action of running, and therefore in your action of running, while you may not intend to pluck any grass, you definitely will pull out some grass as you run, and therefore be considered a sick ratio, as we learned last week, and that would be a problem, and therefore the Mishnah Berurah recommends not running through the grass on Shabbos. However, the Aruch HaShulchan does say that it's okay even to run in the grass, and that would be based on something else we learned last week, and that is the fact that it's a sick ratio to lo michalei, and it's midirabanan for another two reasons, because it's destructive, it's not the normal way to cut grass, and putting that all together would be permitted. Why does the Mishnah Berurah say to avoid it? Shlomo Zalman Auerbach suggests that perhaps it's actually beneficial to pull out the grass because it clears the path, it makes it easier to walk, and that would make it a sick ratio to nichale, and as we learned last week as well, when it's a sick ratio to nichale, when the second action is beneficial to you, then it would be a problem minat Torah.
Okay, it sounds pretty clear and pretty simple, the applications of kotzer. Is there anything else within this melacha?
So on a Torah level, we basically cover most of the applications of kotzer, of reaping, of cutting things, detaching them from the ground on Shabbos. However, like in a few other areas, Chazal prohibited certain actions ramifications that would very easily lead us to violate the Torah rule. One of the examples the Mishnah says in Beitza is in Olin ve'ilan mishum shvus. Mishum shvus means that Chazal prohibited us from doing an action that in and of itself would be okay, but could easily lead us to violate a Torah prohibition. And therefore, one is not allowed to climb a tree on Shabbos because once one's on a tree, one might very easily pluck something off the tree. That is according to Shulchan Aruch, that you're not allowed to climb a tree. And not only you're not allowed to climb a tree, you're not allowed to make use of a tree or shake a tree or lean your full weight on the tree. Technically, this should only apply to fruit-bearing trees because that's where the concern really lies. However, it would be too complicated to distinguish every time and try to figure out, are there fruit here, are there not fruit here, and therefore Chazal prohibited all trees. A common, perhaps frustrating application of this is that it also would be prohibited to sit on a stump. Once the stump has grown above 3 tvachim, which is approximately 11 inches or 27 centimeters, whatever works better for you, that is considered halachically a tree, and it would be a problem to sit on the stump. Below that, a smaller stump, that's like considered part of the ground, and therefore you'll be allowed to sit on it just like you're allowed to sit on the ground.
So that's in the case if I climb on a tree to use a tree. What happens if I use a tree by mistake? Let's say a ball gets stuck in a tree. What then?
But the Shulchan Aruch does say that if you hang something on a tree before Shabbos, you would not be allowed to take it off the tree because that's considered using the tree as well. Nevertheless, the poskim assume that if it's something that's unintentional, you didn't mean for the ball to get stuck there, or your hat to fly off, your kippah to fly off onto the tree, it would be permitted as long as you're careful. Like I said, you're not allowed to shake the tree, you're not allowed to climb the tree, you're not allowed to move the tree or lean on it, but you would be allowed to carefully take that item off the tree or off the bush.
So that is unintentionally using a tree. What happens if I use a tree intentionally? Let's say I have a ladder leaning on a tree and I climb on that ladder in order to get to somewhere else. Or let's say I have a hammock connected to a branch on a tree. What about those things?
Great questions and very practical questions. The Shulchan Aruch says that stadei ha'ila, that the sides of trees are also prohibited to be used. And therefore, if a ladder is leaning on a tree, you would not be allowed to climb on the ladder because the ladder is like the side of the tree, touching the tree, and that would be a problem. However, the Shulchan Aruch says that sidei stadim, if it's twice removed from the tree, it would be permitted. Most common example, let's say you have a tree that has a hook connected to the tree, and then you have a hammock that's hanging on that hook. So that hammock is twice removed from the tree, and therefore it would be permitted to sit on that hammock on Shabbos. However, to put the hammock itself onto the hook on Shabbos, it would be a problem because you're making use of the sidei ha'ilan, you're making use of the side of the tree by connecting the hammock. So if the hammock's on from before, it would be okay, but you would not be able to connect it to the hook on Shabbos. What about a swing that's hanging up on the branch up there? So that would sound like it's a problem because the swing is actually hanging onto the tree. And so for you to sit on the swing is using something that's attached to the tree. One could argue, perhaps, that really it's the rope that's attached to the tree and it's the seat that's attached to the rope. Maybe it's double removed. However, the Shmir Shabbos Gilchas Paskins, that's a problem because we view the rope and the seat of the swing as one item, and that one item is leaning on the tree, and therefore it's only once removed from the tree, not twice removed like a hammock that's connected to a hook. Of course, a hammock that's wrapped around the tree itself would be just like a swing, and that would be a problem on Shabbos.
Wow, great. So as we've seen, there's a lot of details within Hilchos Shabbos, and it is amazing to see how everything starts all the way from the Torah, all the way down into our today's Shabbos, into our backyards and living rooms and how we live our life. And as we know in life, it's all about crossing the T's and dotting the I's. It's always about the little details. In order to have the greater picture, you have to take care also of the little details. You have to remember those little details. Great, amazing. Thank you for your time.
Great as always. Lots of fun.
Great. So we'll talk next week again.